first started the archives, the first few years, we were invited to so many places to go and speak, um, to lesbian groups, to gay and lesbian groups, um, and some of them were small and some of them were large. And we were excited by what we had at the archives, and so we would pack up different things that we wanted to do for what's called in the United States show and tell. And over time, the bags got heavier and heavier, and what we wanted to share was just growing greater and greater. And so we decided at that point, wouldn't it be wonderful if we established a slideshow? That was back in the days when there were slides and carousels and a slide projector, all of which we then started schlepping around with us as we went from organization to organization. What we did was we took pictures with our cameras, not cell phone cameras, but real cameras, of the objects that we thought would be important to talk about. And we divided it sort of first into two trays, but three sections of those two trays. So the second tray, to talk about that first, the second tray was just pictures that people had sent us or that we had taken of women, lesbians from the community, doing different things at groups, at marches, and just with each other or singly. And we found a lot of music that was appropriate. Some of it was sort of what was current then. So you had Alex Dobkin and other women from different musical recordings, and then some older ones that we had that had to do with like Sally Go Round the Roses, and some other older historic blues songs as well. And so that second tape, second cassette, we coordinated as best we could with the music, hoping that they would both end at about the same time. And then the first tape was sort of thematic, and in some ways it was divided into two parts. The first part was really about the philosophy of the archives, the mission of the archives, the material of the archives that we had wanted to take with us, that we had wanted to carry, so that people could see that. And the second part of that first cassette was something that we could also change. We changed a lot of things as time went on, depending on where we were going and what we wanted to say. But the first part, again, as I said, of the first cassette, we talked about the mission and what we were doing and the collection. And the second part was to try to inspire the people who we were talking to get involved in different ways. So we talked about, for example, regional archives, because that was important to us. It was our mission, not that we would be the kind of head archives and then have these little satellite archives, but we wanted people in different communities to really look at their own communities and set up their own archives appropriately based on what was going on. Another thing that we talked about was how we had found material, and then not every ounce of material came to us because somebody put it together neatly and said, oh, this is my collection and I want you to have the material that way. So we talked about one of the more important ways was something we called the gutter letter, where in actuality, in New York City and maybe in other cities, once something is on the street, it becomes basic public property. That's how a lot of people had furnished their apartments actually in New York City, by going out on collection days and finding couches and bookcases and things like that. But everything, and so somebody found for us, we didn't know what it was, somebody found for us file folders, and we had announced to our friends that we were just getting started and we were short of cash, and so one of the things we needed was file folders. And so a friend of ours called us up and said that he had found this box on the street with the millions and zillions of file folders in them. And if we only came down and we would clean it out, and with a file folder, if it's written on one side, you flip it and cross it out, and you have a great new file folder. And this was, of course, before we fancily knew about archival file folders and acid-free folders and all those kinds of things. We just knew we had to have file folders. So we go down to his house, and I can still remember he made egg salads for us. See, we each remember different things, and I remember food. He made an egg salad for us, and we ate and chatted, and then we dug into this big box of material, and we thought, okay, let's just throw out everything. And we started to kind of throw out things, and as we were throwing out things, we realized, wait a minute, look at this. This is a lease between two women living together. Look at this. This was some photographs of these women. Look at this. This is an incredible love letter. A love letter from one of the two women to the other woman. Powerful, powerful letter. We called it the candlelight letter because that in part was how it ended. And so what we discovered was that in the gutter, a life of a lesbian woman and a second lesbian woman had just been tossed aside. And we had to do some research, which we did, and we found out that what had happened was, and I'll use her name, Eleanor Coit. Eleanor Coit had an apartment, and this other woman had lived there for many years, the woman who wrote the gutter letter, the love letter. And then she had died, and Eleanor lived on, and Eleanor took sick and was in a nursing home or a hospital or a nursing home and died in that facility. And so whether it was her family or the building itself, cleaned out her apartment and put some of what we consider the most important papers of her life on the street. And that was the gutter letter.
The letter is handwritten circa 1920. This is a very quiet letter, Eleanor dear, and you won't read it when you are dashing off somewhere in a hurry, will you, please? Thursday night. Best beloved, I'm writing by the light of the two tall candles on my desk with the flaming chrysanthemums you arranged before me. It's such a lovely soft glow, and I'm glad because this is a candlelight letter. I wish you could know what a wonderful person you are, Eleanor darling, and what joy your letter written last night gave me. Not the part about me. That is pitifully wrong and only a standard for me to measure up to, but you make it all so wonderful and are clear about it. You know, I feel terribly much the way you do about it all, but I never could say so, even in incoherent fashion, and so many times back of my nobler resolves, I am just plain selfish about wanting you to look at and talk to, especially in the future, when I know you won't be there. And that's why you are so wonderful, darling, because now I never can be, but I shall have to strive, oh, so ardently, to ever measure up and be worthy and of you at all. And I'm not afraid, dear. I know our love will help, oh, so much, and not hinder, dear. It never does that, not even in my weakest moments. It is true, isn't it? But the glorious part of it is there can be both. The candles are burning low, dear heart, and the world is very still and beautiful outside, and I am so, oh, so happy that I know you and love you, and may God bless you through all time, Alice. And that it has become to give that it a life and a body and a story is one of the purposes of this new thing called the Lesbian Herstory Archives. The challenge of the archives was to replace this history of degradation and shame with reclaiming our own bodies. And here you see the images that pathologized us in early sexual studies that measured our bodies as the bodies of deviants. And then you'll see us reclaiming, and we always were doing it, our way of loving, our culture, and the joy in our bodies rather than the judgment. One of the challenges we had from the beginning, and one of our desires, was to be as inclusive of all the gender presentations that lesbians had created for themselves through the years. And so here you see images of a passing woman, a woman who passed as a husband to her lesbian wife. You see Billy Timpton, who passed as a man, and it was all about making sure the archives was an inclusive archive. In 1970s, we already knew we had a very complex gendered history. This is a story of how the Lesbian Herstory Archives came to hold the papers and diaries and books of Marge MacDonald. Marge first became known to us one summer work night of 1976, perhaps, or 77, when a therapist called us and said that she'd heard about us and that she had a client who was suffering depression and felt that she would die without leaving a mark. And so she said, well, why don't you call this new project the Lesbian Herstory Archives? And this was Marge who was to call us. And Marge lived in Syracuse, New York, which is maybe, I don't remember, a 5-hour drive from New York City. And Marge called, and we had been alerted to her call. So we suggested to her, Deb and I, we would come with our slideshow and drive it and give her her own showing of it. And she was thrilled. And so we did. We packed up Pigpen, and we went up to Syracuse, and we met Marge MacDonald in her home, much of which was packed with as she would call lesbiana, books and vases and, old hairbrush and comb things with two women featured on them. And she took us to the neighborhood lesbian bar in Syracuse, and we showed this slideshow, and it was hard to get the women away from the pool table, but Marge loved it and promised and gave us our actual first donation. I think maybe it was $50 towards the purchase of a home for the archives. I remember saying goodbye to Marge. She drove us to the outskirts of the city, and she was standing in a rather desolate big parking space, and we waved, and that is how our first meeting with Marge. A few years later, we received a call, first from a friend of Marge, saying that Marge had died and alerting us to the fact that her lawyer was going to call us. And in the next few hours, again, a lawyer, an elderly man with a Midwestern twang, because Marge had moved back to Nelsonville, Ohio, where she was born in an Appalachian town, and she had fled that town because she knew she was queer and there was no acceptance for her, and worked as an insurance and investigator, I think, in Syracuse, New York. But she had always dreamt that she would, and this I remember she told me as I was interviewing her. We spent the night with Marge in her lovely home and worn, lovely home. She said she always dreamed of going back and walking down the main street of Nelsonville, Ohio, holding the hand of her lover. And this, unfortunately, she never survived to do. She decided to go back to Nelsonville. She packed up all her belongings, including her lesbiana, and had sent them home in boxes, but died from a heart attack before she could unpack her own belongings. The lawyer called to tell us that Marge MacDonald had left in item the fifth of her will all her writings and lesbian-themed materials to the Lesbian Herstory Archives. He said, you know, she must have been a very sick woman to do that. That is how her family learned she was a lesbian. And I, in my own prejudiced way, said, no, I think it's perhaps the healthiest thing she ever did. He said, you have to do something. The family is destroying her possessions because they don't want her lesbianism to become public. You have to get here quickly. And we were working, living in New York City, and that night, and it was again an Archives of Work night, we all put all the volunteers, everybody put our heads together, and we went to our little old computer, because remember, this is like now 1979, and we saw, how can we find a lesbian in Columbus, Ohio? So first we went to the Ohio University sites, and we found women's studies, and then we said, well, there has to be lesbians there, and sure enough, we found two women whose names were there. We called them Cole, just like that. They understood immediately. They had a big van, and they said they will go to Marge's home and rescue her materials. So then we called the lawyer back and told him that these two women were deputized to represent the archives. And he said, you know, after speaking with you, I went back to Marge's home, and I got on my hands and knees, and I looked around, because first he had said, I wouldn't know a lesbian thing if it bit me. He got down, and he found her unpublished novel, and he was holding it for us. So the women went, they did pick up everything. We saw them later, well, maybe 6 months later, when Deb and I and others could manage to get out to Columbus, Ohio, and bring Marge home. So she asked that all her work be kept in one spot, and we did that. There's an accounting of this story with some changes in the Lesbian Herstory Archives newsletter number 10, February 1988. But also in that newsletter, there's a sonnet by Marge. Sonnet number 28 by Margaret MacDonald. Others before have walked the path I trod, their arms entwined with dark companion death. Some bravely silent, others crying God, and all felt upon their cheeks the breath of the betrayer and the fatal touch, and mostly not a trace to mark their day. Only a few survived the deadly clutch by walking first and marking all the way. A vaccine here and there, a symphony, a telescope, a bit of radium, a square of canvas for the world to see. Is there anywhere one to count their sum? Having a leg too short for such a pace, I can but lag and die and leave no trace. And that is why having her materials at the archives is a way of erasing her fear of having no knowledge of her life exist. And in a way, that's at the heart of what the archives promises our lesbian communities.
In the slideshow that people are seeing, there's the Buffalo area, and some of those wonderful historic moments when the women talked about and showed us their tattoos that they had tattooed on their wrists of the blue star, which was a way that the women of the community in the past had identified themselves to others. You kind of wore your watch over it, but then when you wanted to be known, you kind of just slipped it up that way so other people would know who you were.
Very early on, we knew we didn't want to be a role model archives. We wanted to collect everything we could, rather from outside our community as well, that helped to create the culture around lesbians and had comments about lesbians. We wanted to make sure that the archives did not reflect the class and race, and now I would say gender divisions of the society around us. And so very early on, we were dedicated to making sure women from all backgrounds knew the archives was their home. And here is a picture of the first Black lesbian study group that was held at the archives. From the LHA newsletter number 1, 1974, our founding members, Deborah Edel, Joan Nestle, Julia Penelope Stanley, Pamela Oline, Sale Calavero. We started LHA despite its many challenges, but ultimately we wanted to build community and to show other lesbians that their existence was valuable. We toured these slideshows to create communal trust and to build a home for our histories. Over the years, we occupied 2 buildings, the first in Manhattan at 215 West 92nd Street, apartment 13A, and the second, and still going, on 14th Street in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn. And in both occasions, the community supported us with donations of time, materials, and love. Now, because of this generosity of our community, we have a permanent home owned by LHA at 414 14th Street, Park Slope, Brooklyn. It is incredible what we can do when we stand together.
I hate not being able to hold my lover's hand, sat under some dim lit table, afraid of being